Okay, folks, it's your Wrestling Rememberings with your buddy Mike Messier. 1990 Great American Bash took place, I guess it's 30 years ago today, July 7th, 1990. And, everyone goes right to the main event. We'll get there. Sting, Ric Flair. I did not attend this Great American Bash as a youth. However, I do recall sitting around with some friends, watching this thing and having a great old time. And because we had been to the previous 2 years, the 88 and 89, it was easy enough to kind of put ourselves, sense memory from just a year or two earlier, back into the arena. So although I did not attend this one, the 1990 Bash, having been to the 88 and 89 Bash, I felt a kinship with what the arena was going through. I felt more that I was in the arena had I been watching something, say, from Madison Square Garden or some other Yankee town that did wrestling. So the 1990 Bash is listed as the 6th Great American Bash of one kind or another. Some years they were pay-per-views. Before then they were tours. The biggest tour was probably the 86, or probably the most creative successfully was the 86, although maybe box office wise 87 was bigger, who knows. But going into my memory bank here, folks, the undercard of this show is very interesting. You start off with Brian Pillman, the original Brian Pillman, Flying Brian, over Buddy Landau. And, we had already seen Brian Pillman debut on pay-per-view the previous year at the 89 Bash with a victory over Bill Irwin. So back in those days, folks, things moved at a slower pace. We were going through this transition from the house show years into the pay-per-view era that we're still kind of in. It's a little bit different now because pay-per-views are so frequent, and the WWE at least doesn't do pay-per-views. They do network specials, as I call them. But back then there was growing pains, and someone like Flying Brian wasn't someone they catapulted to the top of the storylines. Here he was a year into his tenure, and he was still kind of in the opening match. But he won his opening match, and Buddy Landau was always a guy that Jim Cornette or others will talk about, was one of these untapped potential wrestlers. Always put forward a good match. Didn't have the best physique. His character was so closely shadowing Ric Flair's Nature Boy character, same era and everything. So Buddy Landau really never got out of the shadow of Ric Flair, a shadow that he put himself in, except maybe in the continental areas or the Memphis areas or so on and so forth and so on and so forth. What else the fuck do we have? Really interesting match. Harley Race, who we hadn't seen as wrestling fans in about 2.5 years, I guess, from when he lost his, or maybe a year and a half, when he lost that King vs. King match to Haku at Royal Rumble 89. Here was Harley Race back on the show wrestling Tommy Rich. And I remember the commentators doing a fairly good job of positioning this match as a battle of former rivals for the NWA World Heavyweight title, which would go back to like 81, 1980, 81, 82, and Tommy Rich borrowed the world title for 4 days. And here they are in the pay-per-view era, and they're really on like the third or fourth match on the show. Harley won the one match, surprisingly. It seemed like it might have been a favor from Rich to Harley or whatever the fuck. But I remember Harley Race winning that match. He was also wearing like a purple outfit with a crown on it, kind of like his old school WWF outfit, which he just never bothered. He didn't have anything else to wear, so there he was wearing his WWF uniform as the King. Then you had Big Van Vader making his WCW, I guess, was this his pay-per-view debut? I guess it was. It was Vader's pay-per-view debut against Tom Zenk, but then he wouldn't be around for another 5 or 7 months. And Vader coming out with that helmet, and I recall at the time being impressed by this guy, being impressed by the helmet, but because he only did the one match and was never on again, we just didn't know if this was a one-shot deal and this guy was just here once and that was it. because he was this, and we knew that he was Leon Baby Bull White from the AWA, 4 years earlier. But Tom Zenk really got no offense in. It was really just a way to display Vader. But if you look back in your record books, folks, I think Vader had that one match and then was gone. So those were some of the preliminaries. I think you also had Dutch Mantell, furry Dutch Mantell putting over Doug Furness in a nice match. Was there another preliminary match? Mike Rotundo, I guess, won a match over the Iron Sheik. Is that correct? I'm going by memory here, folks. And then you had something, and then you get into the mid-card. Now, there was a very thick mid-card on this show of a lot of tag team matches, important tag team matches. The other thing you should remember about this show, folks, is this was only a 3-hour pay-per-view, no pre-show. There was a dark match of David Sierra and Mr. X, but 3 hours, and they had some really long matches on this thing, and they had some good tag team matches. They had the U.S. Tag Team title match, which was this is probably the match that most people remember from this show besides the main event. Midnight Express defending the U.S. titles against the wild-eyed Southern Boys of Tracy Smothers and Scott Armstrong. And at this point, Brad Armstrong was such a talent, but his younger brother, one of his younger brothers, Scott Armstrong, was actually doing a lot better than him in this tag team. It was a great match, an 18-minute match. A lot of fans were cheering for the Midnight, as Jim Cornette would say. I always call them the Midnights myself because there was two of them at any given point. But it was a great match, a match ahead of its time. Everyone says it, but watch that. Tracy Smothers, Scott Armstrong, wild-eyed Southern Boys, later known as the fucking Young Pistols. Midnight Express match. Great match. You got the Rock and Roll Express. They had been on the shelf for a while or doing the indie scenes, and they were brought back to challenge Doom for the NWA World Tag Team title. Now, some people get confused, and they think that why was there two titles for tag teams in the NWA at this time, or WCW? It's because there was just a lot of great teams, and this NWA US Tag Team title, the US Tag Team title was basically something they created in September of '86 to replace the National Tag Team title, which Ole and Arn Anderson vacated. By the way, folks, Ole and Arn never had the NWA World Tag Team title together. They never fucking did. They had the National Tag Team title. Ole got injured. Ole was on the shelf. Another little known fact. People sometimes say Ole Anderson, his version of the Four Horsemen, with fucking Tully, Arn, and Rick was the best horseman. Guess what? Ole was injured half the time. So he really wasn't that great of a horseman. Sorry, Ole. He just was injured most of the time. There's even interviews with Flair and Tully saying the Three Horsemen. Look into it. So Ole really was never that great. So they vacated this National Tag Team title. Instead, they had a U.S. Tag Team title tournament on the same night, I believe. They had a unification match between U.S. champion Nikita Koloff and national champion Wahoo McDaniel. And the winners of that U.S. Tag Team title tournament were Ivan Koloff and Crusher Khrushchev. So that was your first U.S. Tag Team title champions in '86. They would go on to lose to Windham and Garvin, Barry Windham and Ronnie Garvin, then the Midnights, and blah, 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 fuck. So the tag team belts really became a thing that Bobby and Stan were known for, and here they were already 3 years later, like on their third reign, defending against these wild-eyed Southern Boys. You had more fucking matches. I just talked about the Doom, and the fucking Doom was Butch Reed and Ron Simmons. They had a great match, and they won over the Rock and Roll. The Steiners beat the Freebirds in a very fun match. People really liked that match, even though there was no belt. So you had three big tag team matches right there in the middle of the show. You also had probably the worst waste of talent on the show was this six-man tag match. The fucking JYD, Junkyard Dog, Paul Orndorff, and What's-His-Dick, Elegante, in a six-man against Barry Windham, Arn Anderson, and Sid Vicious. I mean, if you just had a Barry Windham versus Paul Orndorff match, or if you had Barry and Arn against Orndorff and Dog or something, you could have, I mean, honestly, the Dog, Orndorff, Giante side was very weak. Somehow they won on a DQ. This was really just to establish that this was a good guys show. So, you know, Meltzer has said on a really good podcast about this show, The Lapsed Fan, that, you know, and I think that was where Meltzer talked about it, that they really should have had, you know, JYD fucking, or maybe it was in his Observer and Conrad talked about it with Grilling JR or something, but they should have had the Horsemen win this fucking match to keep the Horsemen hot, but they didn't. They had the DQ. Then you had a really interesting match, which I think has gone severely underrated. You had you had fucking what's-his-dick, Mean Mark Callis, challenging the Lex Luger. So you had this Luger-Callis U.S. title match, which I contend was a very good match. Supposedly, Bruce Pritchard, without a T, has said that this match was not something Mark was proud of, or the Undertaker, who would become the Undertaker. Vince McMahon saw the match, wasn't impressed, or they try to hide it from me. I don't get that. I thought it was a good match. Luger wins clean to retain the title, and I thought it was a good match. I thought it was a good outing by Mean Mark in his U.S. title match. Also a good match from Luger. I think people like to shit on Luger and his wrestling abilities. I think Luger had some good matches in this era against Danny Spivey. He defended the U.S. title in February. He defended against Mean Mark here. Eventually, you know, he was kind of in a tough spot because of the whole Sting injury and so forth, which gets us to our goddamn main event. I don't think I'm forgetting anything. There was 12 matches on this show. If I forgot any big match, it was important. One thing of note, folks, you did not have a Dusty Rhodes. You did not have a Tully Blanchard. You did have not a Tully Blanchard. He was on the shelf because of the cocaine situation with WWF, and NWA didn't want to hire him. So you didn't have Tully. You didn't have Dusty. Dusty was with, I guess Dusty was still with WWF at this time. And you didn't have the Road Warriors. The Road Warriors had left. So a lot of key players that we were kind of born and bred NWA guys were no longer with us. So it all comes down to Sting. Give him credit, coming off a knee injury. I don't know if Sting had any warm-up matches. I think I might have read somewhere that he had like one tag team match the night before or somewhere at a house show, just a warm-up match before this pay-per-view return. But to go from February all the way until July and not really be in the ring, but rehabbing his leg. And of course, during that era, we had the RoboCop and we had all this shit. The Capital Combat, Robot, Sting, Robot, Cop, and Sting. But here we had Sting versus Ric Flair, New Revolution, 14,000 fans, and it really is a great match. And there's a lot of, it's odd because it's like a lumberjack match only for Sting. Because Sting's got the Steiners, he's got fucking, he's got the Steiners, Orndorff, Dog. I don't know if Elegante, I think Elegante comes out at the end. Luger was kind of noticeable by not being there. Then the Horsemen try to trot out, and, you know, Sting wins the goddamn match. And how did we all feel about this thing when we were watching it? We felt very excited. I mean, I've said in other videos that the NWA World Champion at the time, most of my youth, was like the goddamn president. So Ric Flair was always our president. And when Ric Flair lost a title match, whether it was to Ronnie Garvin or Dusty or Steamboat, or in this case Sting, or even Kerry Von Erich, it was a big effing fucking deal. We got excited. It meant something to us. Now, I don't know if you fans, if it means something to you, if Charlotte Flair loses a women's SmackDown title and 2 weeks later she's wrestling for the NXT women's title, or, I mean, I know one guy on Twitter is very obsessed with Kairi Sane, gets very worked up about Kairi Sane, and granted, she's a beautiful young woman and a great talent, but, you know, I don't know. I mean, I guess it's the power of wrestling that even the bad wrestling gets you hooked and emotionally involved. And that's why I'm trying to not refute or to mock today's current wrestling fan, because I was a young fan myself. I believed in all these fucks. And I got all worked up and excited. And so you assholes getting all worked up and excited, I can understand your plight, with a P-L-I-G-H-T, plight. It means something to you. And so in this world of coronavirus and police brutality and elections and creepy Uncle Joes and Trump tweets and all this goddamn bullshit, it's nice to know that you can sit there and you can watch your wrestling even if there's no fans in the audience and enjoy it. But for me as a youth, I don't know if I could properly, I tried to share with you that we're all kind of sitting around. There was, underage alcohol, perhaps, all types of shenanigans, watching this pay-per-view and enjoying it. And I know that a friend of mine in later years, Brian Danovich, he was in New York, Long Island, watching this pay-per-view with his family and telling me that his family, like his mom would make this big platter of food, but the platter of food for the pay-per-views would be in the kitchen, so the kids had to go to the kitchen to get themselves a plate of food or to eat something and come back to the living room to watch the matches, which I thought was quaint, very suburban. Everyone kind of, how do I say this, idolizes their own youth or puts their own youth or their own teenagehood on a pedestal. You know what I mean? It's like Citizen Kane with fucking Rosebud. We all fucking long for the escape of our childhood memories, and we forget that we were going through some bullshit as kids or teenagers as well. But the Great American Bash 1990, from an enjoyment standpoint, from a fan standpoint, it was pretty much right up there. The show, the card itself was so different than, say, even the 88 performance, like the 88 Bash, where you had still the Horsemen, the golden era Horsemen of Wyndham, Tully, Arn, and Flair, J.J. Dillon. You flash forward 2 years, there's no Road Warriors, there's no Kevin Sullivan. Jimmy Garvin's turned heel again. Luger, in 88 was a babyface. In 89 Bash against Steamboat, he was a heel. Back in 90s, a face again. So what the F? What the fuck? So, Luger, that era, always had these annual heel turns. Anyway, fucking folks, if you get a chance, if you can find a bootleg copy somewhere, or if you are a WWE Network subscriber, it's not going to cost your dick any harm to put on the Great American Bash 1990 and enjoy that show for what it is. I know I just spoiled all the goddamn results for you. But, if you're a picker and a chooser, I guess, go to this Doom Rock and Roll Express match, go to the Luger, Mark Callis, that's the Undertaker, by the way. Go to the Sting match. If you're curious about an early Vader, it's pretty much a quick match over Tom Zenk. And so on and so forth, and so on and so forth. And you can just see the enjoyment of the raucous Baltimore arena at its finest. And it's interesting because for a 3-hour pay-per-view, that show is fucking stacked. So it's Mike Messier with the fucking wrestling memory. Look, folks, all you assholes that are giving me a hard time about the wrestle rides, thinking that I'm going to kill somebody when I have a car mount. I'm very safe with those wrestle rides, but I've been listening to your concerns. You're concerned about me and my safety. I don't want you to get all worried about me, so I parked the goddamn car for this fucking conversation. MikeMessier.com. Keep listening to the Wrestling with the Future podcast. Wrestling with the Future on YouTube, of which I'm a contributor and a panelist, and we've had Magnum TA, we've had Baby Doll, we've had the handsome Jimmy Valiant, Boogie Woogie Man, Sam Houston, and more. So Mike Messier saying goodbye. MikeMessier.com.